At 85, Shirley Caesar finally admits what we all suspected. I've cried in green rooms more than I've cried at home. Those were the quiet words whispered by Shirley Caesar, not from a pulpit or a concert stage, but in a rare, unguarded moment. The woman we've hailed for decades as the First Lady of Gospel, the voice that shook church rafters and stirred souls across generations, finally let us in. And what we saw wasn't just a legend. It was a woman who carried wounds behind every worship song. At 85 years old, Shirley Caesar isn't chasing awards. She's not singing to prove anything anymore. No, she's revealing a truth so raw, so long buried, it might change the way you look at her forever. Because behind the sequins and Grammys, behind the sermons and the spotlight, was a soul quietly battling heartbreak, loneliness, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of being perfect for everyone else. She never had children yet. She mothered a nation. She never chased fame yet became a cornerstone of gospel music. She never asked for a crown yet was named royalty. For over 6 decades, Shirley was expected to be the rock, the vessel, the voice of strength. But now she admits there were days she didn't feel strong at all. There were nights she questioned her own purpose, moments when the robe felt heavier than her faith could carry. And what's most surprising, she stayed silent all these years, not out of fear, but out of duty. I was the face of faith, she confesses. I had to smile when I wanted to scream. Now, at an age where most step away from the spotlight, Shirley is stepping into something even more powerful, her full truth. She's no longer holding it in. She's no longer hiding the cost of her calling. And the confession isn't a fall from grace, it's a deeper revelation of it. So what did she finally admit? What truth had she protected all these years? Why did she carry grief, betrayal, and burnout in silence while the world cheered for her? This is not just the story of a gospel superstar. It's the untold journey of a woman who endured more than we ever imagined, and now, with the weight finally lifted, is ready to tell it all. Before she was the First Lady of Gospel, before the world came to know her as a vocal powerhouse and spiritual leader, Shirley Caesar was just a little girl in Durham, North Carolina, born into struggle shaped by sorrow and carried forward by something greater than herself. Shirley Ann Caesar was born on October 13, 1938, the 10th of 13 children in a deeply religious but financially poor household. The Caesar family didn't have wealth, privilege, or comfort. They had hard floors, hand-me-downs, and hymns. Their home was often filled with prayer, the scent of Southern cooking, and the unshakable sound of gospel. But underneath that rhythm of survival was also the pain of loss. Her father, James Caesar, worked as a tobacco laborer during the week, toiling under the southern sun. But on Sundays, he transformed into a roaming preacher, moving from church to church, sharing sermons and singing praises. His presence lit up the household not just because of his deep faith, but because he infused their lives with music and conviction. He was a humble man with a gift for stirring the spirit. But tragedy struck early. When Shirley was just 7 years old, her father died. His death sent a tremor through the family. The stability he provided, even if only spiritual, was gone. For a young girl, that loss would mark her for life. Shirley later said, "I didn't understand death, but I knew something was missing, something that made the house feel colder." Her mother, Hallie Caesar, had no choice but to step into the role of both parents. She was a woman of steel will and soft strength. She scrubbed floors in white folks' homes, cooked for neighbors, sang in the kitchen, and somehow kept the family from falling apart. It was Hallie who insisted that all her children, no matter how poor they were, never lose sight of education, respect, and God. And she recognized something special in Shirley. By the time she was 8, Shirley had already found a new way to express her grief and longing music. At church, she sang her first solo. When she opened her mouth, even the oldest elders in the congregation stopped talking. The voice that came out of that small girl wasn't just powerful, it was anointed. The way she sang didn't just carry notes, it carried burdens and lifted them too. "I didn't choose gospel music," Shirley once said. "Gospel music chose me." By age 10, she was already well known across her hometown for singing at revivals, tent meetings, and local services. Pastors would invite that little girl with the grown woman's voice to come sing on Sunday mornings. And every time she sang, there was a sense that it wasn't just a performance, it was a ministry. Her voice told stories of pain, of yearning, of deep faith. Listeners said it sounded like she had lived 100 lifetimes before she even hit her teenage years. But the reality behind the curtain was much harsher. Her family still struggled to eat. Winters in Durham were cold, and heat wasn't guaranteed. Shirley remembers nights when they slept fully clothed under piles of blankets, praying for warmer days. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and they had Jesus. Her mother made sure of that. Even with her rising reputation in the gospel world, Shirley never neglected her education. Her mother insisted she balance her studies with her musical commitments. She walked miles to school and sometimes went to sing at churches afterward without even changing clothes. Shirley didn't complain. Singing wasn't a burden. It was salvation. Music was how I talked to God, she would later say, and how he talked back. It wasn't long before her voice reached beyond Durham. Word began to spread in neighboring counties, in cities far beyond North Carolina, about a teenage girl who could bring an entire congregation to tears with a single note. That word eventually made its way to Albertina Walker, leader of the famed Caravans, one of the most respected and electrifying gospel groups in the country. In 1958, at just 18 years old, Shirley Caesar received an invitation that would change her life, an offer to join the Caravans. It wasn't just a music group, it was a spiritual force led by Walker and featuring names like James Cleveland, Cassietta George, and Dorothy Norwood. These were not just singers, they were voices of the black church prophets with microphones. For a girl who had only known small-town churches and poverty, this was both a blessing and a terrifying leap into the unknown. She had never traveled far from home, had never ridden a tour bus, had never faced the pressure of singing night after night in front of thousands. But she said yes, not because she felt ready, but because she felt called. Joining the Caravans meant long tours, sleeping in cheap motels or sometimes on buses, eating what little they could afford. It also meant facing racism in the Jim Crow South, being turned away from restaurants, dealing with hecklers, and surviving on faith and grit. But Shirley never backed down. Every city was a mission field. Every song was a sermon. Her stage presence was unlike anything gospel had seen. She stomped, shouted, fell to her knees, and belted from her soul. Songs like Sweeping Through the City and I'm Not Tired Yet became more than gospel staples. They were spiritual battles fought in real time. Within the Caravans, she found mentorship, sisterhood, and challenge. Albertina Walker was both a guide and a gatekeeper, pushing Shirley to hone her talent, control her energy, and understand the weight of her gift. And Shirley grew not just in voice, but in wisdom. She began to understand that her music wasn't entertainment. It was responsibility. And yet something inside her stirred. By 1966, after nearly a decade with the Caravans, Shirley Caesar made a shocking and deeply personal decision: she would go solo. It was a risk few were willing to take, especially as a young black woman in gospel music. The group had given her security, exposure, and credibility, but Shirley felt something deeper calling her not to sing louder, but to sing freer. Her mother had always told her to follow God's voice, not man's. And so, even without a big label contract or a guaranteed audience, she stepped out on faith. "God was calling me to stand on my own," she would later say. And I had to listen. That decision was the ultimate test of everything she had learned up to that point. Her resilience, her vision, and her ability to carry her message without a choir of voices behind her. With her debut solo album, My Testimony, Shirley didn't just sing songs. She shared her life, the death of her father, the poverty of her youth, the spiritual tug-of-war inside her soul. Her voice cracked with truth and people listened. She wasn't singing to be heard, she was singing to heal. The foundational years of Shirley Caesar's life were not paved with fame, but with faith, fire, and fearlessness. Every note she ever sang came from those roots, a child of poverty, shaped by pain, chosen by God, and refined by fire. She wasn't molded by the industry. She was molded by loss, by long nights, by unanswered prayers, by whispered songs in cold bedrooms, by a mother who kept the faith when everything else fell apart. And as she stepped into the next chapter of her life, rising in the gospel charts, facing new challenges as a solo artist, Shirley Caesar would carry those early years with her like sacred stones, not as weights but as witnesses to the divine calling that had chosen her from the start. When Shirley Caesar walked away from the Caravans in 1966, she wasn't just stepping out of a group, she was stepping out onto water. No safety net, no big label, no gospel giant backing her. Just her voice, her God, and a calling that whispered louder than her fear. What followed was not a sudden leap to stardom, but a grind, a faith walk paved with rejection, late nights, spiritual warfare, and the kind of pain only purpose can explain. Her first solo project. My Testimony didn't just introduce her to the world, it introduced her to herself. The album was stripped down, raw and emotional, filled with stories drawn straight from the well of her soul. She didn't sound polished. She sounded real. Critics didn't quite know what to make of it, but the people did. They weren't just listening. They were healing. In that moment, Shirley realized she wasn't just called to sing gospel, she was called to live it out loud. What made her rise so unique wasn't just her voice, it was her truth. Gospel was changing. The civil rights movement had shaken Black America to its core. The church wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a battleground for justice, identity, and power. Gospel artists were being called to do more than sing about heaven. They were being asked to speak to the struggles on earth. Shirley Caesar rose in that moment not with political rhetoric, but with songs that carried fire, truth, and conviction. She wasn't afraid to shout. She wasn't afraid to cry. And she wasn't afraid to say that God could meet you in the mess before he ever marched you into the miracle. With her soul-stirring delivery and unapologetic stage presence, Shirley became impossible to ignore. Her concerts weren't performances, they were spiritual encounters. Audiences didn't just clap, they wailed. Church pews became altars. Concert halls turned into revivals. When she sang "Jesus, I Love Calling Your Name," it felt like the sky might split open. Her voice didn't just reach ears, it gripped hearts. But her journey wasn't without resistance. Many in the traditional gospel world questioned her fire. They called her too emotional, too theatrical, too radical. But Shirley didn't flinch. "I wasn't trying to be different," she once said. "I was just being obedient." As her catalog grew, albums like I Remember Mama and Her Very Best, so did her influence. She became one of the few gospel artists who could sell out arenas without crossing over to secular music. She didn't need to water down her message to reach the masses. She simply sang the truth, and people, churchgoers and non-believers alike, responded. But Shirley's greatest rise came not just through her music, but through her ministry. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, she wasn't just a singer, she was a pastor, a teacher, and a trailblazer. She began traveling globally, taking gospel music beyond America's borders to Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean. Wherever she went, the message remained the same: faith in action. And people saw that her anointing wasn't manufactured, it was authentic. Shirley didn't need light shows or backup dancers. All she needed was a microphone and a testimony. Then came Hold My Mule, a song that would change her trajectory all over again. Released in the 1980s, the sermon song told the story of Shouting John, an old church member who refused to stay silent when the Spirit moved. The church tried to quiet him, shame him, and remove him, but he shouted anyway. It was more than a catchy track. It was Shirley's manifesto. It was her story. A defiant declaration of holy boldness. The song became a gospel staple, not just in churches but on radio stations, and decades later on the internet, where a line from the performance I got, beans, greens, potatoes, tomatoes, was remixed into a viral Thanksgiving meme. While many laughed and danced to the beat, those who knew Shirley's legacy saw something deeper. A woman who'd spent a lifetime being told to be quiet and instead chose to shout louder. Throughout the 1990s, Shirley became a fixture in American culture. She appeared on BET, TBN, and even in mainstream television programs. She was no longer just the gospel girl from Durham. She was a national treasure. Awards began to stack up. Grammys, Stellar Awards, Dove Awards, NAACP honors. And in 2000, she was inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. Yet through it all, Shirley never lost touch with her roots. She still preached at her local church, still visited prisons, still showed up at hospitals to sing for the sick. Her rise to fame was never about elevation, it was always about assignment. Fame didn't change her. It just gave her a bigger platform to do what she had always done: serve. In 1983, she added a new dimension to her ministry when she married Bishop Harold I. Williams, the presiding bishop of the Mount Calvary Holy Church of America. Together they became a spiritual powerhouse, he from the pulpit, she from the choir stand. Their marriage wasn't about celebrity, it was about calling. They traveled, preached, and built outreach ministries together, feeding the poor and mentoring young pastors. Their union grounded Shirley in ways that even music couldn't. By the time Shirley reached her 60s, she had released over 30 albums, preached across continents, and stood beside presidents and preachers alike. But she never stopped being Shirley, the girl who sang her first solo in church at 8 years old, the girl who cried for her father, the woman who walked away from the caravans to follow a whisper from God. In 2016, as the viral remix of Hold My Mule swept across the internet, many assumed it was the peak of Shirley's cultural relevance. But they were wrong. The meme didn't reduce her. It reminded the world of her reach. Young audiences discovered her. Older fans revisited her work. And Shirley, she laughed, danced, and used the moment to testify all over again. Because even at the height of her fame, she never lost sight of what she called her true mission: to tell hurting people that God still loves them, that He still sees them, and that their story isn't over. She never pursued crossover appeal, but it came anyway. Shirley collaborated with Whitney Houston on the song He's All Over Me for the soundtrack of The Preacher's Wife. The track introduced her to millions who had never set foot in a black church but found something familiar in her voice. Even Whitney said of her, Shirley's voice doesn't just carry sound, it carries power. And that's what truly defined her rise. Not the awards, not the viral moments, not the headlines. It was the power in her praise, the way she made the broken believe again, the way she turned stages into sanctuaries, the way she stayed grounded even as the world called her royalty. Shirley Caesar didn't just become famous. She became foundational to gospel music, to black culture, to faith-based art. She didn't just ride the wave of gospel's popularity, she built the wave. And though her voice earned her acclaim, it was her spirit that made her unforgettable. As the 2000s rolled on, Shirley's presence only grew. She received 12 Grammy Awards, a Lifetime Achievement Award, and even a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Presidents invited her to speak. Civil rights leaders called on her voice. And churches still packed out every time she sang. But if you asked her to name her greatest accomplishment, she wouldn't mention the accolades. She'd say this: when someone walks up to me and says, "Your song got me through," that's what matters. Her rise wasn't accidental. It wasn't even orchestrated. It was divinely ordered, step by step, heartbreak by heartbreak, victory by victory. And now, decades into her career, Shirley Caesar still sings, not because she needs to, but because the calling never left. She rose not by chasing fame, but by chasing faith. For decades, Shirley Caesar stood as a pillar of unwavering faith, a force of light, resilience, and spiritual fire. But what the world didn't see, and what Shirley never let fully show until now, was the darkness that shadowed even her brightest stages. She kept secrets not out of shame, but out of a sense of responsibility, believing that as the face of gospel, she had no right to fall apart in public. The truth is, Shirley Caesar's life has been marked by a quiet kind of suffering, the kind that creeps in behind closed doors and gnaws at the soul in silence. And for the first time at 85, she's ready to say what many always suspected: the journey almost broke her. It began with loss. The death of her father when she was just 7 left a hole that not even faith could fully fill. She sang through the grief, but it never truly left her. It lingered in the corners of her voice, in the tremble of every note, in the sigh between verses. "I missed him every time I looked into the crowd and wished he could hear me sing," she once confessed. Then came the pressure. As her fame grew, so did the weight of expectation. The gospel industry, while rooted in spirituality, could be just as ruthless as any secular business. Behind the robes and church hats were egos, politics, and competition. Shirley was often expected to be flawless, to never falter, never get angry, never complain. "I wasn't allowed to be human," she said in a recent interview. "I had to be holy, even when I was hurting." That image became her prison. She smiled when she wanted to cry. She performed when she was sick. She showed up to pulpits after sleepless nights, and no one ever saw the pain under the sequins. In hotel rooms and green rooms across the country, she faced bouts of isolation, physical exhaustion, and emotional collapse. But she kept singing, because that's what gospel warriors did. One of the most painful aspects of her life was her childless marriage. While Shirley and Bishop Harold Williams shared a deeply spiritual love, their union was never blessed with children. They poured themselves into their ministry, mentoring hundreds, perhaps thousands of young people. But when the lights dimmed and the crowds went home, the silence in their home was often deafening. "I have spiritual children all over the world," she said. "But there were nights when I sat in my home and wished someone called me Mama." That longing, so personal, so deeply human, was something Shirley never spoke of publicly until her later years. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted strength. And for so long, she believed that sharing that void would make her seem ungrateful for the life she had been given. But there were other wounds too, ones the public never saw. She faced betrayals within the church, moments when those she trusted most turned their backs or used her name for their own gain. People she had prayed for, defended, and supported in private would later criticize her in public. She never responded, never exposed them. "I let God fight those battles," she said. But that doesn't mean they didn't hurt. There were also battles with burnout, spiritual exhaustion so deep it made her question if God was still speaking. She admitted there were seasons where she would stand on stage singing and preaching to thousands while feeling completely empty inside. "I'd lay hands on people and then go cry in the hotel bathroom because I didn't feel anything for myself," she said. "I was feeding others but starving spiritually." And yet she felt she couldn't stop. The brand, the legacy, the expectations, they all demanded that she keep moving. Even when her husband, Bishop Harold Williams, fell ill in the early 2010s, she kept the ministry going. She preached while caring for him, sang while grieving in advance. And when he passed away in 2014, Shirley entered what she calls the darkest valley of her life. "He was my partner, my covering, my best friend," she said. "When he died, I didn't just lose a husband. I lost the one person who truly understood what it meant to carry a calling this heavy." In the aftermath of his death, Shirley went silent for a time. She didn't cancel appearances, but something had shifted. Her sermons were still powerful but tinged with sorrow. Her songs still rang with conviction, but the vibrato carried tears. Those close to her say she went through a deep season of reflection, asking God if it was time to stop, if her mission was done. And just as she began to re-emerge with renewed strength, the world threw something unexpected her way: internet fame. The viral beans, greens, potatoes, tomatoes remix of Hold My Mule swept across social media like wildfire. Younger generations laughed, danced, and created memes. Shirley initially embraced the joy, saying, "If it gets people to the gospel, let them dance." But soon she was caught in controversy. Some traditionalists called the remix disrespectful. They accused her of allowing sacred words to become comedy. Others said it cheapened her decades of ministry. Shirley was devastated. She had never tried to go viral. She had simply allowed a clip from an old sermon to live again. For a woman who had spent her entire life protecting her image, the meme felt like a loss of control. I started wondering if people would forget the message and just remember the joke, she admitted. The internet made her a star all over again, but it also brought new scrutiny, new misunderstandings, and a fear that she was becoming a caricature of herself. Still, Shirley did what she had always done. She prayed, she pushed forward, and she refused to be defined by anyone's opinion. Not church elders, not fans, not critics. Because she knew something they didn't. Her story was never about being perfect. It was about being faithful through imperfection. And now at 85, she's finally ready to say it out loud. She's finally pulling back the veil. Shirley Caesar. The legend, the First Lady. The powerhouse was also a woman who broke a wife, who grieved a leader who doubted, and a believer who sometimes needed to believe again herself. Her confession isn't scandalous. It's sacred. Because if someone like Shirley Caesar, who gave everything to her calling, could carry silent sorrow and still sing, maybe we all can. When Shirley Caesar finally broke her silence, what she gave us wasn't a confession, it was a communion. Not of shame, but of strength. She invited the world not into her triumphs, but into her truth. And in doing so, she didn't diminish her crown, she solidified her legacy. Her voice has always been powerful. But now we know the weight it carried. Every note we ever heard came not just from vocal cords, but from scars, from a woman who stood on countless stages while quietly grieving losses that never made the headlines. From a servant of God who was asked to carry others when she could barely carry herself. From a soul who gave the world her all and only now is allowing herself to finally rest in her own story. And maybe that's the greatest sermon Shirley Caesar ever preached, not from a pulpit, but from her pain. A reminder that faith doesn't mean the absence of hurt. It means showing up anyway, singing anyway, loving anyway. She didn't have to tell us this truth. She could have kept the image clean, the legend untouchable. But instead, she chose something braver. She chose honesty. At 85, Shirley has shown us what true greatness looks like. Not perfection, not fame, but resilience in the face of heartbreak, service in the face of loss, and faith that never bowed to applause. She leaves behind more than songs. She leaves behind a blueprint. For every young gospel singer wondering if they're enough. For every black woman told to be strong while breaking inside. For every servant of God who thinks their pain disqualifies them from purpose. Shirley Caesar's story says, "No, you don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You just have to be faithful." And as she steps into this new season of life, not as the face of gospel, but as the keeper of her truth, we honor not just the icon, but the woman. Because the truth didn't make her smaller. It made her eternal. So now we ask you, what part of Shirley Caesar's story moved you the most? Was it her rise from poverty, her silent grief, her perseverance in ministry, or the quiet strength it took to finally speak her truth? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe stories like Shirley's deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, where we celebrate the icons, the warriors, and the truth-tellers who shaped our world not just through talent, but through the battles they survived in silence. Because behind every legend is a truth that deserves to be told.